Sometimes, the expectations of your parents can be a heavy load to bear. Some of us may rise to the challenge, while others descend into a spiraling path of failure. However, what if this spiraling path came to a dark and grisly end? Henry Chau's story was one of those. He was a consistent failure and never managed to achieve anything of value in nearly 30 years of his life. But how did this man react to the pressures of his parents? And how did his actions shock an entire nation? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, folks. My name is Adrian, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. Now, today we're looking at the strange case of Henry Chau. Now, I don't normally feel the need to put a trigger warning at the beginning of a video. However, I'm going to make an exception for this one, so you have been warned. You know, it's quite strange how I find cases these days. I came across this one while researching the case of Abby Choi. As you'll find out, the stories are remarkably the same. Before we begin, did you know that I post true crime and strange cases here weekly? So if that does sound like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel, it really does help me out. And now, as always, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Henry Chau. Today, we're heading back to a fairly familiar location, and that is the special city of Hong Kong. Hong Kong, known locally as Shangang Tebi Xing Zhengku, is a very unique nation, comprised of various small islands. The once British Crown-owned region boasts various incredible and interesting features, and with a population of around 7.4 million residents in a 400 square mile area, it is one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Now, Hong Kong's existence is remarkably unique. In 1997, the region became separated from the mainland of China, running the mantra of one country, two systems. This separation gave Hong Kong the freedom of autonomy over all matters outside of foreign and defense affairs, at least until the year 2047. With the main administrative center being found in Victoria, it also plays host to being the major trade and financial center of the region, as well as being a highly popular harbour. Taking the Star Ferry between the various islands allows you to soak up the unique atmosphere here, which is often described as being where the West meets the East. For reference, think Chinese food and Mickey Mouse all in the same region. Some other unique features include a Disneyland theme park, the Temple Street Night Market, Causeway Bay, and Repulse Bay, which is a crescent moon-shaped beach that tourists flock to in the warmer weather. Now, of course, all of this fascinating scenery is best observed above the skyline, and let me tell you, there are plenty of options when it comes to rooftop bars. Anyway, it is here in Hong Kong that we find the antagonist of our story, and the name today is Henry Chau Hoi Liang. Born on June 7th, 1983, Henry was the second son of Glory Chau Wing Ki and Moon Sui Yuit Yi. Now, not much is publicly known about Glory's and Moon's past, but they'd been married for many years and were aged 65 and 63 during the events of today's case. And the family of four, including Henry's older brother, lived together in an apartment in Sai Ying Pun. Henry's childhood was largely unremarkable. However, it is noted that his parents supported him to the very best of their abilities. They even paid for his private tuition and his piano lessons. However, it does seem that none of these things were actually what Henry wanted for himself. Even from a very young age, he was often described as living in his own world, and by the time secondary school came around, he barely had any friends and began to fail school. Of course, this was an extreme disappointment to his parents, and when he began to fail his school grades, they decided to step in to do something about it. In a fresh bid to provide a life with education, Henry was sent to Canberra in Australia to start a new course in actuarial mathematics. Interesting side note, but something I found out recently. Did you know that Canberra State is actually in the shape of a parrot? Kind of funny, right? Anyway, it seems that this venture was also destined for failure, as over time, Henry became the subject to a lot of bullying and discrimination. And eventually, the mental strain caused by this harassment, alongside his failure to do well at school, forced him to drop out in the year 2003. After dropping out, he returned to Hong Kong where he lied to his parents, telling them that he had successfully graduated. However, as you can likely imagine, it didn't actually take long for Glory or Moon to figure out the truth. They were understandably incredibly disappointed in their son and even attempted to get him back into education, doing this by forcing him to attend a university in Hong Kong. This attempt, though, was once again turned into yet another failure, and after this he became withdrawn and turned to the world of online gaming, which appeared to be the only place he reportedly felt any sort of respect. He managed to maintain a small circle of friends here, but would often talk about very worrying topics with them. This included telling them that he believed he was a psychopath, and across most of his social media he used an image of Adolf Hitler. Now, academia was not the only thing that Henry underperformed in his life either. To put things short, he was a miserable partner, losing any sort of girlfriend he had, and as you can likely imagine, this was due to his lack of compassion and care. After getting one of those girlfriends pregnant, and upon finding out, he told her to terminate her pregnancy. The young woman refused, however, and chose to keep the baby instead. And in typical old Henry fashion, instead of stepping up to the mark to help raise the child, he cut all ties with the mother and decided to have nothing to do with either of them ever again. Drifting in and out of various jobs, Henry failed to keep one for more than a few weeks at a time. He would either be fired due to his performance, or he would randomly quit on the spot. In fact, the only job that Henry could nail down was his own role as a pianist, though he would never want his parents to know that. Anyway, it was during one of those jobs in the year 2007 that Henry met someone who is rather important to our story today, and his name is Angus Tse Chin Kei. Angus, who was aged 35, was a Macanese man who is often described as a gentle and pure soul. Unfortunately though, he wasn't academically gifted, and when compared to Henry's relatively high IQ of 126, Angus sat at a low-ranging 84. Friends would often comment that Angus was easily manipulated and would happily do what others wanted in exchange for friendship or good food. He wasn't romantically fortunate either. The first girlfriend he had tragically died while they were still together, and when he eventually married his first wife, on their wedding night she confessed that she'd only used him to obtain a Hong Kong citizenship. Side note, by the way, she was already married too. Anyway, he eventually moved to New Zealand, where he then fell in love with another woman. However, in a rather cruel twist of fate, she left him high and dry after scamming him out of all of his money, this eventually forcing him to return to Hong Kong in 2010. The heartbreak and betrayal played heavily on his mind, and sadly, over the next few years, Angus made several attempts to take his own life. Now, all three attempts were unsuccessful, however, it did come at a price. And after swallowing mercury, he suffered a permanent change to his mental health, and was never quite the same again. Dwindling mental health can be a devastating thing to experience, and as a lot of us will know, those who experience it will be left feeling helpless and vulnerable. Now, there are various things you can do in this situation, ranging from constructive things like therapy and antidepressants, all the way down to destructive things like drugs and alcohol abuse. During this time frame, Angus was down in his luck, and his way of coping was by grasping at anything or anyone that made him feel happy. The problem is, people can inherently be selfish, and not everyone should be trusted, and unfortunately for Angus, this was very much the case for his friend Henry. By the end of 2012, Henry had found himself in a rather large amount of debt. He had done well to stick to his usual mantra of failure too, and unemployment aside, he had lost even more money after making several poor investments. Up until this point in time, he mostly survived off the love and money that his parents gave him. However, this didn't stop him from indulging in his own lavish lifestyle too, and despite no income, he continued to eat good food and buy himself many expensive outfits. To add to this, Henry was often described by others as taciturn and pretentious. He often looked down on other people, scoffing and abusing those who seemed to be of lower class or taste. Growing tired of the situation and wanting to have a life of their own, both Glory and Moon had long encouraged Henry to find a job so he could move out. However, with frequent pushback from their son, tension between the man-child and his parents started to rise over time. By the year 2013, arguments were frequently erupting in the household, and this was for very obvious reasons too. Put short, Henry was an absolute leech, and his parents were frustrated but too giving all the same. All of this came to a boiling point in February 2013 when another huge argument broke out, and this one was caused by a very strange request from Henry. He suggested that his parents should sell their flat and split the money 3 ways, 1/3 going to him, 1/3 to his brother, and the other 1/3 to themselves. Now obviously the couple said no. They were reaching retirement soon and had their own plans to relax and kick back. They had grown fed up with his bullshit, and in this moment they asked him to move out of the property. And as you can likely imagine, this went down like a ton of bricks with Henry. In response, he stormed out of the property never to return again, and also cut all contact with his family. It's unknown where he stayed during this time frame, but in the following weeks he began to plot a very devious scheme. And this scheme would leave Hong Kong reeling with shock and horror. March 15th, 2013. It was during the early morning that police were scrambled to a family home in the suburbs of Hong Kong. Following a tip-off, they were keen to arrest a man in his late 20s who lived at the property. A chilling confession over a WhatsApp group chat had prompted this so-called tip. The confession described the actions of a man who had just murdered his own parents, and shortly after their first arrest, a second arrest was made too. If you hadn't guessed already, the two to be arrested this morning were Henry Chau and Angus Tse, and as for the confession, it was from none other than Henry himself. With the concerning messages in mind, police proceeded to search the apartment. Trying not to laugh at the names here, but located on Phuc Chak Street in Tai Kok Tsui, the property belonged to his friend Angus, and immediately after entering the home, they knew that something was very, very wrong. Bloodstains covered the floors and walls, trash bags were found filled with cement and sand, and various weapons were spotted throughout the property, this including a saw and 7 knives. However, all of these terrifying clues were nothing compared to what they would find next. Inside the microwave, inspectors saw a thick layer of yellow grease. This was coupled with an overpowering smell of cooked meat, and after opening one of the trash bags, they realized what was cooking, as this bag was filled with severed human limbs. Before carrying on with our case today, we must first wind the clocks back to 2 months prior. And it's here that we find ourselves at the beginning of Henry's evil plan. After storming out of his parents' property, Henry failed to understand them. In his mind, he was entitled to their estate, and he further believed that they were accountable for all of the failures in his life too. Henry believed that, following all of these arguments, too much had happened between them. Way too much emotional disparity existed now, and for that, they needed to die. This would be something that investigators later learned from him, but Henry believed that, if he could resolve the emotional connection between him and his parents by killing them, he could finally be reborn. It was at this moment that Henry manipulated his friend Angus to help in his evil scheme. Given his kindly but easily manipulated nature, it wasn't actually that difficult either. But just to make sure, he promised to kill Angus's mother should he deny his request. In the months leading up to this fateful day, Henry made several purchases. This included almost a dozen knives, a microwave, a cooker, and of course, 2 new fridges. And what he planned for his parents on March the 1st was a horror beyond all comprehension. 6 days had passed, and Henry's older brother was beginning to grow concerned. He hadn't heard from his parents in almost a week now, which was very unusual. Henry tried to reassure his brother. Perhaps Glory and Moon had simply gone on holiday to China, but Hoi Ying was rather skeptical about this idea. The situation seemed too strange, and so, with this in mind, he therefore reported their disappearance to the police. As the authorities began their investigation, they found no evidence of them ever departing the city, which did nothing but raise further eyebrows. Something seemed to be very wrong. As a result, the brothers created missing persons campaigns on social media, pleading for any information on their whereabouts. It was noted that the last time they were seen was around March the 1st, near Langham Place in Mong Kok. Henry would even reach out to Apple Daily, where he made a public appeal for help. However, none of these campaigns were successful in finding Moon or Glory. And 9 days later, on March the 15th, the reason for their silence became all too clear. Officers searching the flat found themselves in the middle of a nightmarish scene. A bin bag that they had just searched contained multiple human limbs. The microwave was covered with human grease. And perhaps the strangest part to all of this, but more than 600 styrofoam lunchboxes were found in the apartment. All of them contained the salted and cooked meat of Glory and Moon. And upon searching both fridges, both of their heads were found within. A notepad was discovered underneath Angus's mattress. Inside, the pages detailed messy notes on how to dispose of their bodies, and a shopping list of the items that were required. The book also highlighted that their bones were to be covered in sand and cement before eventually being thrown into the sea. And as for the unaccounted body parts, well, it is speculated that they had been cooked and then eaten. Moving into the legal proceedings of this case, and as you can likely imagine, both Henry and Angus were held in custody until their trials began. This was scheduled for August of 2014, but would have to be restarted in February 2015 after 2 jury members were forced to drop out. During his trial, psychologists attempted to shed light on the troubled workings of Henry's mind. It was highlighted that, in the month leading up to the murders, he had repeatedly been listening to Vers la Flamme to psych himself up. One psychologist explained that his actions were heavily influenced by this music, citing, "The music intensified the images of fire and flame in his mind. He believed that the world was going to end, and he could not get away from it." One of the most interesting things about covering international cases is seeing how the justice system varies between countries. And in this instance, I don't think this sort of bullshit would stand up in a Western court. Anyway, in a much more credible manner, psychologists also claimed that Henry was suffering from bipolar disorder and OCD. Now, in my mind, these things are much more influential to his case and the verdict. At least more influential than the type of music he was listening to. However, after a second psychological examination, both of these things were ruled out, and instead they were replaced with a personality disorder and extreme narcissism. Henry would eventually confess that, had he gotten away with his murderous actions, both he and Angus would have fled to mainland China to embark on a killing spree. Apparently, they were planning to assault and kill prostitutes or random women. Both men had 2 very different versions of events when it came to the murders of Glory and Moon. True to his form, Henry never took full responsibility for his actions, and instead he tried to lay some of the blame on Angus. He further claimed that, after he lured his parents to the flat, Angus slit Moon's throat, while Henry stabbed his father in the back of the neck before also cutting his throat. Henry also claimed that he injured his leg during their murders, therefore requiring stitches. This left Angus with the bodies while he sought medical help. Upon returning to the flat, Henry claimed that Angus had already dismembered and butchered his parents' bodies, therefore absolving Henry of any blame when it came to the mutilation. To add to this, he even attempted to frame his friend by placing his notebook under his bed. However, handwriting analysis would eventually confirm that Henry was in fact the author. However, Angus's story was very different to Henry's version of events. You see, Angus claimed that Henry must have killed his parents way before he arrived at the apartment. Apparently, Angus was out of the flat until March the 4th, which would have been 3 days after the fact. He further claimed that he was terrified for his mother's life after Henry threatened to kill her, and that was the reason he agreed to dispose of the bodies. Now, of course, this is all still very gravely illegal, but Angus insisted that he had no part in actually murdering Glory or Moon. Anyway, it seems that both physical evidence and the testimonies available were enough to persuade the judge and jury in Angus's favour. A major contributing factor to their decision was the large gap in IQ between the 2 men, as well as Angus's glowing character testimony from both friends and family. This was in stark contrast to Henry, who the judge described as a narcissist who was preoccupied with fantasies for success. He further commented that he had no feelings for other people, and brushed off Henry's claims that the murders were a snap decision in the heat of an emotional moment. The judge also highlighted, their crime was greatly premeditated, and their planning was extensive. Their preparation gathered pace in January and February, and on March the 1st last year, they carried out the killings as they had planned. Text messages sent by Henry to his friends further weighed into his overwhelming guilt. In these messages, he claimed that he was a psychopath. I cannot empathize with the normal person's pain because of the experience of my childhood and adolescence. My process of emotion is very different from a normal person. On March the 20th, 2015, a verdict was finally reached. Henry Chau was found guilty of the double murder of his parents, whereas Angus Tse was found not guilty. Both men were separately found guilty of preventing the lawful burial of a body, and both received separate sentences because of this. Henry Chau was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 9 years and 4 months. This was very different to Angus's, who was sentenced to 1 year for the prevention of the lawful burial of a body. Interesting side note here, but Angus had already served 2 years in prison while awaiting his trial, and was therefore way overdue his release. He was therefore allowed back into the real world immediately. As for Henry, the judge's closing statement was, "People may wonder why you did this. The fact that there is no obvious answer is what makes you so dangerous," which is quite true in my opinion. There was no plausible reason to kill his own mother and father. Henry is a selfish monster through and through, and now he must pay for his actions for the rest of his life. Glory and Moon wanted nothing more than to see their own son grow up to be a successful and happy man. But instead, they had to witness Henry make one poor decision after another, despite all their guidance and advice. For that, I can fully see why they were disappointed. Whilst there is nothing wrong with the aim of being content through a simple life, Henry made a huge mistake in believing it was okay to take advantage of his own parents. Even worse, he saw them as expendable objects. Right to the point of termination. It's a bit of a shit story really. I think I feel most sorry for Henry's brother, as now he must live the rest of his life without his parents, all while knowing that Henry was the one that took them away. I hope that he's found peace after these horrific events, and as for Angus, I hope he's managed to stay out of trouble. Anyway folks, I think that's all I can stomach for this case today, so I'm going to wrap this one up. I do hope that you found it interesting, even though there wasn't much media available. So please tell me, what do you think about this case? Do you think that the right verdict was reached? And do you think that Angus was actually manipulated? Please do share your thoughts in the comments section down below, as I really do love reading your opinions and seeing what the general consensus is. Thank you once again for joining me here on Coffeehouse Crime. I really do appreciate you watching my videos. And as always, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so, it really does help me out. I also have a Patreon if you want early access, exclusive content, and much more. And if you want to follow me on my adventures, please do follow my social media, I'll leave the links down below. But for now, I wish all of you a good rest of your day, and as always, I'll be back again very soon for another video. However, until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and of course, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.